You're about to enter a story that begins in silence and ends with a question no scientist can yet answer. What if something out there, beyond every telescope, beyond every known world, was never a comet, but a message? In this video, you'll uncover the truth behind 3I Atlas, the object that changed the heartbeat of our planet, the signal that turned light into language, and the mystery that's still echoing through every atom of the universe. So sit back, let the silence pull you in. You've come to the right place. Whisper Science.
Welcome. You are watching Whisper Science. Make sure to subscribe and join us for more amazing science content. Now, let's move back to the video.
Out there, beyond the measured edges of our solar system, something has begun to move against the grain of everything we thought we understood. It's not rushing toward us in violence, nor drifting away in silence. It's pulsing, like the faint rhythm of a cosmic heart hidden behind a curtain of light. Astronomers first noticed it as a dim smear against the backdrop of stars, another visitor from the gulf between suns, just one more frozen relic from the birthplace of worlds. But then the data came in, and the numbers refused to behave. They called it 3I Atlas, the third confirmed object to wander into our solar system from interstellar space. At first glance, it was ordinary, a faint magnitude, a cometary tail, a predictable arc through the heavens. But beneath the ordinary shimmer of dust and ice, there was a pattern, a rhythm so exact it made computers hesitate, as if the universe itself had suddenly decided to tick like a clock. The discovery began quietly, as such things often do. An observatory nestled in the snow-drowned outskirts of Irkutsk was running routine photometric scans. Two mid-career astronomers, their names barely known beyond academic circles, were processing data from a survey meant to track near-Earth objects. The screens were filled with the usual noise, streaks of satellites, cosmic rays, the flicker of distant suns. Then one of them, bleary-eyed from the night's endless hum, noticed a fluctuation that shouldn't exist. Brightness rising and falling with mathematical precision. Every 2 hours, almost to the second, they reran the data. Same result. They adjusted for atmospheric distortion, telescope drift, software error. Still there. A perfect pulse cutting through randomness like a beacon in fog. Words spread quietly through encrypted academic channels, the kind that keep excitement hidden behind professional restraint. At first, colleagues offered the usual explanations: instrument calibration, sampling bias, random coincidence. But when observatories in Chile and South Africa confirmed the same light curve, the skepticism began to crack. Something out there was blinking with purpose. The object's trajectory placed it on a long hyperbolic path, a one-way journey through our solar system. It wasn't bound to the sun. It would come, whisper its secret, and vanish back into the dark. Yet for the brief time it would pass within reach of our instruments, it promised to answer, or complicate, some of the oldest questions we've ever asked. What is motion without intent? Can a rock know rhythm? Can the cold remember the touch of hands that shaped it? Across the ocean, agencies scrambled. The European Space Agency marked the object for high-priority observation. NASA's Deep Sky Network logged the coordinates, though publicly their statements remained cautious. Even the private telescope arrays, owned by universities and corporations alike, pivoted their sensors toward the visitor. Everyone wanted a look. Everyone, perhaps, feared what they might see. Within days, the first composite images arrived. A faint nucleus surrounded by a fragile coma, stretching like a ghost across the stars. The surface shimmered in wavelengths that defied easy classification, reflective but not metallic, translucent but not entirely icy. Spectrographs picked up carbon dioxide, cyanide radicals, traces of nickel, an odd combination for a comet this far from the Sun. And then came the positional data. That's when confusion turned to unease. The object wasn't just rotating, it was precessing in a way that implied control. Every 4 hours, its trajectory nudged, ever so slightly by a consistent fraction of a degree. Not random tumbling. Not the erratic push of outgassing jets. Something measured, something deliberate. To the public, none of this was known yet. Space stories rarely make headlines until they carry drama, the threat of impact, the promise of alien life, the poetry of apocalypse. But inside the world of astrophysics, the tension was palpable. Late-night calls between observatories blurred across time zones. Encrypted emails filled with half-finished thoughts. What if it's self-correcting? One researcher wrote. What if we're looking at active stabilization? Another whispered. Of course, science doesn't traffic in whispers. It traffics in data. So the data was checked, cleaned, and cross-checked again until the pattern was undeniable. Every 2 hours, the brightness spiked, then dimmed. Every 4 hours, the object's position shifted in sync, 2 rhythms intertwined like heartbeat and breath. A 2-to-1 harmonic ratio, too precise for chaos, too clean for comfort. At conferences, some laughed it off as coincidence. Others, less certain, avoided microphones altogether. There's a superstition among scientists, not of ghosts or gods, but of premature claims. To suggest intelligence in the motion of a comet is to gamble your credibility against the gravity of ridicule. So they called it unusual periodicity. They called it statistical anomaly. Anything but what it might truly be. But the silence from major agencies began to speak louder than their words. NASA released no detailed statements. China's space authority went quiet. The European data stream paused without explanation. Only the Russian team continued publishing updates, short telegrams to the global community, daring others to confirm what they saw. And behind every line of technical jargon lay the same haunting implication. This object isn't behaving like anything we've ever tracked. Meanwhile, amateur astronomers, unbound by institutional caution, began uploading raw footage online. Pixelated streaks across black skies, annotated with timestamps and coordinates. Some matched the official data precisely. Others introduced wild speculation, alien craft, hidden beacons, government cover-ups. The internet turned the mystery into mythology overnight. But amid the noise, one truth persisted. The pattern was real. Whatever 3-eye Atlas was, it moved with intent, or something that looked alarmingly like it. To understand why that's so disturbing, you have to know how the universe usually behaves. Comets spin irregularly. They wobble, tumble, disintegrate. Their brightness rises and falls with sunlight, not symmetry. They are relics of chaos, leftovers from creation. For one to move like a gyroscope, to keep perfect time through the turbulence of solar radiation, defies every model we've built. So the questions grew darker. Could it be natural and yet still behave this way? If not, who or what set it in motion? And if it was made, how long ago? Somewhere in a dim-lit control room, a young astronomer stared at the blinking trace on her monitor, whispering a thought she'd later pretend she never said. What if it's listening too? Because that's the unspoken fear that lingers between equations and silence. When you find rhythm in the void, you wonder if it's hearing you back. And so the investigation deepened. Telescopes in Hawaii and Chile coordinated observations to capture simultaneous photometry, hoping to triangulate surface features. Infrared arrays scanned for heat signatures, looking for energy that shouldn't be there. Nothing definitive, just more consistency, more rhythm, more impossible order. By mid-October, the data was undeniable. Something about 3I Atlas was not random. Its motion suggested balance, its brightness suggested purpose, and yet, the universe is supposed to be indifferent. So if purpose exists out there, then maybe we're not the first to feel curiosity under the stars. As winter approached, the comet brightened in the northern sky. People who had never cared for astronomy began stepping outside at night, pointing phones toward the heavens. It looked like a pin of emerald light, faint but persistent, tracing a slow path against the constellations. No threat, just presence. An ancient traveler slipping quietly through our system, leaving behind more questions than comfort. In the end, discovery always begins with confusion. We stare into the dark and mistake mystery for malfunction, anomaly for error. But sometimes the universe insists. Sometimes it repeats itself until even the most skeptical mind is forced to listen. And right now, 3I Atlas is repeating something. A rhythm older than our machines, perhaps older than us. Whether it's natural, mechanical, or something in between, it has our attention. Because out there, amid the silence of a billion suns, one faint pulse has begun to whisper. And it's saying we've just started listening. The first rule of science is that everything, no matter how strange, must eventually make sense. But what happens when sense itself begins to warp around the data? That's what was happening now. Every telescope that pointed at 3I Atlas came back with the same confession. Something about this visitor refused to behave like the universe we know. Brightness fluctuating with metronomic precision. Trajectory shifts repeating with a rhythm so exact it made the term random error sound like denial. In the early weeks, astronomers thought they'd caught an illusion. They spoke of phase angles, observational bias, signal interference from solar winds. But the longer they watched, the harder it became to explain away. Every 2 hours, without fail, the light would climb, peak, and fade, like the inhale and exhale of a living thing. Every 4 hours, the object's coordinates would nudge by a fraction of an arcsecond, then return, as if correcting its own drift. Two rhythms locked together in perfect mathematical harmony. No known comet had ever done that. By late October, the data logs had grown thick with readings, spectral scans, photometric tables, positional records down to the millisecond. To anyone outside the field, it was just numbers. But to those inside, those who'd spent lifetimes chasing the cold logic of the cosmos, the pattern was deafening. It wasn't just motion, it was intention written in mathematics. Somewhere deep in the data archive of the European Southern Observatory, a young researcher ran a Fourier analysis just to test the strength of the signal. When she plotted the graph, two distinct spikes emerged, two clear peaks rising from the noise like mountain summits breaking through fog. The smaller one, 2 hours. The larger, 4. She sat back, eyes fixed on the monitor, realizing she was staring at something the universe didn't usually offer: consistency. Most natural systems are chaotic. They drift, decay, fluctuate with temperature, spin rate, or gravitational pull. Even the most predictable celestial bodies, pulsars, binary stars, planetary orbits, show micro-variations, subtle imperfections that remind us nature never builds machines. Yet 3I Atlas seemed to be doing exactly that, behaving like one. So they started giving it nicknames, quietly, informally. The metronome, the watcher, the object that counts. Names whispered between researchers who didn't dare write them in reports, but couldn't stop using them in conversation. Because sometimes a name helps you face the thing you can't explain, The rhythmic data inspired a new round of simulations. Teams modeled every plausible natural scenario: binary nucleus rotation, outgassing symmetry, gravitational resonance, even internal cavitation from trapped volatiles. Each simulation failed to reproduce the precision. Either the rotation wobbled, or the brightness curve drifted out of phase after a few cycles. Nature couldn't maintain that balance, at least not for long. But 3i, Atlas, did. Night after night, it kept its rhythm. 4-hour trajectory adjustments, 2-hour brightness oscillations, never early, never late. It was as though some invisible clock was dictating its behavior. The Russian astronomers who first noticed it, Medvedev and Pavlov, released their next telegram under quiet pressure. It was short, factual and clinical, as though stripped of emotion by necessity. Yet beneath the data tables, between the numbers and coordinates, was a phrase that sent ripples through the community. No known mechanism accounts for this degree of temporal stability. That one sentence changed everything, because it wasn't just an observation, it was a challenge, an invitation to anyone on Earth who thought they could explain what was happening. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory formed an internal task force under a harmless name, Interstellar Object Observation Review Team. It was staffed by astrophysicists, orbital mechanics specialists, and a handful of data engineers with clearance levels higher than their job titles implied. Their brief was simple: find the flaw, find the glitch, the bias, the misreading that made a comet look like a clock. Weeks passed. The flaw never came. Instead, the data only sharpened. Infrared scans showed surface regions that seemed to alternate in temperature: cool, warm, cool, again every 2 hours. That suggested active energy redistribution, not random heating. Polarization data showed scattered light patterns more typical of metallic reflection than dusty ice. Yet spectroscopy insisted there was carbon dioxide, cyanide, nickel, comet-like materials. It was as if nature and technology had merged into one surface, defying classification. Then came the radar echoes. When the Arecibo Legacy Network attempted a low-power radar ping, the return signal displayed faint interference, not noise, but something structured, patterned like an internal lattice scattering the beam. That shouldn't happen. Radar reflections from comets are usually chaotic, diffuse. This one looked geometric. Still, public statements remained muted. The agencies released nothing but vague summaries: object under observation, data pending peer review, further characterization required. But inside conference rooms and encrypted group calls, the conversations grew heavier. What if this wasn't a comet at all? What if it was something designed to look like one? The idea wasn't new. Science fiction had danced with it for decades. Machines disguised as asteroids, probes cloaked in ice, watchers drifting through time. But this wasn't fiction. This was data, and the data didn't flinch under scrutiny. A few astronomers began speaking cautiously off the record. One veteran from the European Space Agency described it as the first time I've felt the data looking back. Another, from MIT, admitted in a private memo, if this were a satellite, we'd call it controlled spin stabilization, but it's not one of ours. Meanwhile, on the public side of the internet, whispers turned into wildfire. Forums filled with speculation, videos dissecting the light curve frame by frame, AI-enhanced renders claiming to show structures on the comet's surface. Most of it was wrong, but a few images, unintentionally accurate, captured something eerie, a faint symmetry, a balance of shadows along the nucleus, like panels half buried in frost. The line between observation and obsession blurred quickly. Every new reading became fuel for belief. Every silence from official agencies became proof of conspiracy. And yet, beneath the hysteria, something real was unfolding. Something the scientists couldn't dismiss no matter how hard they tried. Because this rhythm, this impossible stability, hinted at a truth too profound to rush toward. If Three Eyes Atlas was a natural object, then it meant nature had built precision machines long before humanity ever learned to forge metal. If it was artificial, then we were already late to the conversation. In late November, an unconfirmed leak appeared on a private astrophysics forum. It contained a fragment of internal correspondence from a major observatory, unsigned, unverified, but written with the kind of detail only an insider could know. It read, "Cross-correlation between positional and photometric periodicity now exceeds 0.995. Harmonic phase stability suggests controlled dynamics, not passive rotation." That number, 0.995, became a ghost statistic. It spread quietly through the scientific community, never officially acknowledged, but impossible to ignore. A harmonic stability of 99.5% was unheard of for a natural body. If true, it was evidence of intention carved into motion. So, what was it doing? And why here now, in this quiet corner of the galaxy? Some suggested coincidence, that our detection was purely accidental, a brief alignment of time and technology. Others suspected observation, that we were being studied in return. But the truth was simpler and stranger. No one knew. The object wasn't broadcasting, no radio emissions, no modulated light signals, no trace of communication, just the steady blink of reflected sunlight in an impossible rhythm. The silence was almost worse than a message, because silence, when patterned, feels deliberate. As December drew closer and the object prepared to pass near Mars, agencies prepared for the closest imaging yet. Probes orbiting the red planet recalibrated their instruments to catch a glimpse as Three-Eye Atlas drifted past. It would be the first time we see it from another world, an outside angle on the visitor that had already rewritten so much. Somewhere inside a quiet control room, a monitor flickered with tracking data, the rhythmic heartbeat of a moving enigma. Each pulse marked another confirmation, another impossibility turned fact. And in that silence, beneath the hum of machines and the murmur of human breath, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. If something built this, then it's older than us, wiser than us, and maybe it's still out there watching what we do next. The countdown had begun. Mars would soon have its turn to see the visitor with its own cold, patient eyes. And when it did, the rhythm we'd been tracing from Earth would reveal a new kind of symmetry, one that might finally force humanity to admit we are not the only architects of precision in the cosmos. Mars had always been a silent witness, red, ancient, and indifferent. But on that week in early December 2025, it became something else. It became the mirror through which humanity stared at a visitor from the deep. As Three-Eye Atlas swept past the orbit of the red planet, instruments across two worlds were pointed toward the same moving point of light. From Earth, telescopes saw only a shimmer. From orbit, Mars offered proximity, a chance to see structure rather than suggestion. The European Space Agency, ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, and Mars Express were both instructed to retarget their cameras. They were not built for interstellar archaeology, but they were all we had. Their sensors strained against their limits, their optics designed for atmospheric study and surface mapping, not for chasing a transient whisper from the stars. Yet, when the first frames came down through the deep space network, even the engineers fell silent. The images were faint, filtered through cosmic dust and the thin Martian exosphere. But after enhancement, patterns began to appear, too crisp, too symmetrical. The nucleus of 3I's Atlas was not round, nor irregular like the shattered snowballs we call comets. It was elongated, almost cylindrical, with facets that reflected light as if off-angled planes. A long exposure composite showed alternating bands of brightness spiraling around its axis, like ridges or panels catching sunlight in sequence. Each reflection aligned with the 2-hour brightness rhythm already observed from Earth. Whatever this thing was, it had geometry. The scientists didn't want to say the word structure. Instead, they wrote albedo variations and anomalous reflectance gradients in their notes. But everyone in the room knew what they were looking at. An object that looked designed to appear natural only from a distance. Up close, it betrayed intention. Telemetry confirmed the same dual rhythm seen from Earth, 2 hours, 4 hours, repeating precisely even as gravitational influence from Mars should have perturbed its spin. The orbiters measured a subtle magnetic field surrounding the object, far weaker than Earth's, but stronger than a simple plasma interaction could explain. The readings fluctuated in step with the rotation, as though the field itself was pulsing. Natural magnetism doesn't do that. Artificial systems sometimes do. ESA's mission log, later partially declassified, described a periodic flux density shift, synchronized with brightness peaks. One line, stripped of context but unforgettable, read, "If this were a probe, the modulation would make sense." When the data reached mission control in Darmstadt, Germany, analysts ran every diagnostic imaginable. Was it sensor noise, solar interference, cosmic rays? Every hypothesis collapsed under verification. The field was real, the rhythm persistent. A frozen object spinning through vacuum should not behave like a dynamo, yet here it was, humming in time. Meanwhile, on Mars itself, the Perseverance relay received the faintest echo in a frequency band no one expected. It wasn't a transmission, more like a reflection of a reflection. A whisper bounced between metal and magnetic field. It lasted only seconds, then vanished. Engineers logged it as unclassified anomaly and moved on. But someone saved the waveform anyway. Its shape, when plotted, resembled a pulse train, a repeating binary pattern that coincided exactly with the brightness cycle. The find was kept quiet. A few internal teams debated whether to escalate, but higher management decided against it. There were no solid signals, no repeating message, only coincidence stacked on coincidence. And yet, that pattern found its way into encrypted academic circles, and from there into rumor. The words binary echo began appearing in late-night emails between astrophysicists who'd long given up believing in coincidence. Back on Earth, the images released to the public were carefully edited. Resolution reduced, color-corrected to look bland. The world saw a fuzzy comet, harmless, pale, and unremarkable. But those who handled the raw data saw something else. The brightness wasn't evenly distributed. It followed seams. Fine, linear seams, like the edges of panels joined by millennia of dust. A cosmic artifact disguised as geology. For weeks, debate consumed every scientific channel. At Caltech, a closed symposium was convened under the title Interstellar Object 3I Atlas, Photometric and Morphological Review. Half the attendees argued natural models. The other half simply stared at the images, unwilling to commit words to what they suspected. One senior dynamicist finally said what others feared to whisper: "If you plotted this object's rotational stability on a graph, it's not a comet, it's a gyroscope." That sentence broke the room, because he was right. Comets wander, Gyroscopes remember, and three-eyed to Atlas remembered its orientation across space like a compass remembering north. News never travels fast through official science, but leaks move at the speed of fascination. Within days, high-contrast versions of the Mars Express frames surfaced on a private astrophotography forum. Someone overlaid the frames into a time-lapse and stabilized the motion. The result looked like a slow mechanical spin, the object catching sunlight at regular intervals. Viewers could almost feel it turning, patient, deliberate. Millions watched before the video was quietly removed. But once you see geometry in the dark, you can't unsee it. Public interest exploded. Mainstream media ran stories that swung between skepticism and awe. Headlines screamed, "Alien probe," "NASA silent on interstellar machine," "Comet or construct." Officials called it misinformation, yet their caution sounded like confirmation. Silence, once again, was louder than denial. Inside observatories, sleep became optional. Teams in Hawaii, Chile, and Russia coordinated a continuous 24-hour observation relay, passing the object from one hemisphere to another like a baton of curiosity. Every instrument told the same story: stable rotation, harmonic brightness, consistent reflectivity angles. And as it drifted farther from Mars, one more anomaly emerged. Its velocity changed ever so slightly, a deceleration so minute it took weeks to confirm, but real enough to unsettle orbital models. It wasn't slowing because of gravity or drag. It was slowing as if by choice. If it was shedding momentum, then something internal was adjusting its motion. That implication, tiny thrusts invisible to our telescopes, was the final straw for many. You can argue away coincidences, but not propulsion. ESA's next internal bulletin was brief and clinical. Observed delta V, 0 to 4 ms over 11 days. Attribution undetermined. No mention of cause, no hypothesis attached, but everyone who read it knew the math didn't lie. Around the same time, radio telescopes began pointing not to three-eye Atlas, but behind it. They were searching for whatever it might be moving toward. No planets, no asteroids, no clear destination. Just a trajectory threading the outer edge of the solar plane, aimed toward nothing we yet understand. In quiet moments between data uploads, scientists began asking quieter questions. If this thing had been traveling for millions of years, why now? Why did it pass through a system occupied by a species capable of noticing? Was that coincidence, or the whole point? One astrophysicist at MIT wrote a line in her personal journal later leaked to the press. If this is a probe, then its mission may already be complete. It wanted to be seen. Meanwhile, as three-eye Atlas glided beyond Mars and into the deeper reaches of the solar system, its rhythm continued, unchanged, unwavering. Radio quiet, thermal balance stable, brightness pulsing every 2 hours like the ticking of an invisible clock. And for those who watched, the question shifted from what it was to who might have sent it. In the weeks that followed, the world returned to its routines. But among those who'd glimpsed the unfiltered truth, normalcy never returned. They had seen precision where none should exist, order rising from cold chaos. And once you see order in the void, you begin to suspect design everywhere. Late one night, a technician at the Canary Islands Observatory recorded the object S light curve one last time before it dipped below the horizon. He whispered to himself, "Still counting, still counting." As the signal ticked across his screen, steady as a heartbeat, timeless as machinery. By dawn, 3 Atlas had vanished beyond the reach of Mars's orbiters, sliding outward toward the space between worlds. But the echoes it left behind, the magnetism, the deceleration, the mirrored reflections, refused to fade. For the first time, humanity was looking at something that might not just exist in space, but remember it. And somewhere, hidden among terabytes of archived telemetry, there lay one unanswered sequence, a faint binary whisper still waiting to be decoded. Perhaps it was noise. Perhaps it was something else. Either way, the data is still there, pulsing quietly in storage, keeping time with a rhythm the universe didn't teach us. Because maybe the universe isn't empty after all. Maybe it's a conversation we've only just learned to hear. And the next message might already be on its way. When the data from Mars finally settled into the world's networks, the silence that followed wasn't disbelief. It was paralysis. Every agency, every observatory, every self-proclaimed skeptic and believer stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. For years, science had been the art of prediction, knowing what the sky would do before it did it. But 3i Atlas had broken that rule. It wasn't behaving like something to be predicted. It was behaving like something performing. In the months that followed, the world's top minds turned inward. Closed-door meetings became the new frontier. Zoom calls without names. Whiteboards erased minutes after use. The kind of secrecy born not of conspiracy, but of fear. The fear of being the first to say the wrong thing about something that might change everything. At Caltech, a simulation team was assembled to test the impossible rotation. Could a natural object maintain that precision under realistic forces, outgassing, solar pressure, gravitational drift? They fed the data from Mars into their models, spinning a digital twin of the comet in the silence of their servers. The computer tried to make chaos look like order, to prove nature could fake perfection. It failed every time. Either the rotation drifted, or the light curve collapsed. The rhythm broke. And yet, the real object kept its beat. The team lead, an astrophysicist named Elena Karas, wrote a single line in her final summary: "We can reproduce the chaos, not the choreography." That line spread quietly through the astrophysics community like a confession, because choreography meant intent. And intent is not something you can simulate out of rocks and ice. Still, most refused to say it aloud. The official stance remained cautious, even conservative. NASA's press release was pure neutrality. Observed photometric regularities in interstellar object 3i Prime's Atlas remain under investigation. Natural mechanisms are being evaluated. But the tone behind those words was brittle, like a glass waiting to crack under its own weight. In Cambridge, a conference meant to discuss exoplanet atmospheres diverted its attention to 3i Atlas almost immediately. Researchers from around the world gathered in a cramped lecture hall, tired from flights but hungry for meaning. No slides were shown. No official transcripts were made. The session simply began with a question projected in white text on a black screen. How do you prove something isn't alive? The room fell silent. Because that's what this object was forcing them to confront. Not life in the biological sense, but life in the behavioral sense. It was self-stabilizing. It was self-correcting. It repeated patterns as though bound by memory. And memory, in any form, is not something comets are supposed to have. Meanwhile, journalists began to close in. Freedom of information requests flooded space agencies around the world. Most were denied. Those that weren't a T were so heavily redacted, they read like poetry, fragments of truth surrounded by black ink. But even redaction can reveal intent. Whole paragraphs were missing under sections labeled spectral phase correlation and thermal harmonics. Why censor data about sunlight and temperature? unless the sunlight and temperature were doing something they shouldn't. DT. As pressure grew, an anonymous email began circulating through scientific circles. It contained a single attachment, a heavily compressed data file allegedly extracted from Mars Express telemetry. Within hours, the file had been mirrored across forums, decrypted, analyzed, and dissected by enthusiasts and professionals alike. What they found wasn't an image or a sound. It was a sequence. Binary. Repeating. 8 bits. Pause. 8 bits. Pause. Over and over. The numbers translated into nothing obvious. No ASCII letters. No prime patterns. No coded coordinates. But the timing of the pulses matched the 2-hour light variation of 3I Atlas exactly. Whether the file was real or fabricated didn't matter anymore. The idea had escaped into the world. If it was real, then the object wasn't just spinning, it was broadcasting. If it wasn't real, it still represented what people now wanted to believe, that somewhere out there a message was waiting, and we had finally been quiet enough to hear it. Meanwhile, in the quiet corridors of academic institutions, the tone shifted from skepticism to obsession. Graduate students rewrote their theses mid-semester. Astrophysicists who'd built careers on probability began running out of words for what they were witnessing. And yet, across all this feverish speculation, one question kept resurfacing. If it's artificial, then how old is it? Calculations based on its velocity and trajectory suggested 3I, Atlas, had traveled for millions of years, perhaps hundreds of millions, long enough for civilizations to rise, fall, and vanish before its arrival here, and yet its structure, whatever it was, appeared intact. No catastrophic erosion, no disintegration, no random tumbling. It had crossed light years and survived, spinning like a time capsule built to endure eternity. A strange pattern also began to emerge in the data logs. Whenever 3I Atlas was observed from multiple locations at once, Earth-Mars orbital arrays, the brightness didn't just pulse, it synchronized, as though the reflections aligned differently depending on who was watching. That shouldn't be possible. Yet one report from the European Southern Observatory documented observer-dependent amplitude variation. In plainer terms, it knows where you're looking. Nobody wanted to write those words into a paper, but everyone who'd seen the plots understood the implication. Something about the object reacted to observation, not physically, not quantum mechanically, but through geometry, through light. And that small eerie possibility that it might be aware in some way turned the scientific fascination into something closer to reverence. Not everyone was convinced. Skeptics pushed back hard. They argued that we were seeing only what we wanted to see, that our desire for meaning was projecting intelligence onto coincidence. They reminded the public that we've made these mistakes before. The WOW signal of 1977, the face on Mars, the canals of Percival Lowell. Each time the unknown had seduced us into misreading nature's randomness as design, but others countered that 3I Atlas was not a blur or a shadow or a radio glitch. It was a measurable, trackable, physical object performing the same inexplicable dance again and again under scrutiny. If it was coincidence, it was the most disciplined coincidence the universe had ever performed. By early 2026, tensions between camps began to split research collaborations apart. Some universities demanded peer review before releasing further findings. Others refused to share data altogether. Conferences became battlegrounds of disbelief and wonder. One night in Tokyo, during a live panel broadcast to millions online, two physicists from rival teams broke into open argument on stage. One insisted it was a natural formation, an icy binary nucleus stabilized by feedback resonance. The other laughed bitterly. "If that's nature," he said, "then nature just out-engineered us." The clip went viral within hours, and for the first time, the world's attention wasn't on whether aliens existed. It was on whether science could handle it if they did. Behind the noise, governments began to get involved. Space agencies quietly redirected satellites to collect additional telemetry. Data centers in Colorado, Paris, and Dubai received encrypted packets labeled Deep Object Monitoring. At least one classified report suggested there was reason to suspect intentional emission of low-energy photons inconsistent with reflected sunlight. That line was later redacted in every version released to the press. And through all of it, 3i Atlas just kept spinning, calm, steady, indifferent to the turmoil it had caused on the one planet capable of wondering about it. Its light pulsed on schedule, its path remained true, its presence unyielding. If there was intelligence behind it, it showed no interest in conversation. If it was natural, it mocked every definition of nature we had. So either way, humanity was left staring into the mirror of its own insignificance. Late one night, a radio astronomer in India tuned his array not to listen, but to echo. He transmitted a narrow-band pulse timed precisely to the object's brightness peak. The signal traveled across space for minutes, then returned, reflected faintly off the comet's icy shell. Nothing remarkable, except the timing. The echo arrived not at random, but delayed by exactly 2 pulse intervals. 2 hours later it came again, weaker but structured, as though the universe itself had developed a memory. He never published the result. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe interference, or maybe, just maybe, the visitor had answered. By then, one thing had become clear. Whether it was machine or miracle, comet or construct, 3i Atlas was rewriting the boundaries of what science could explain. And the deeper we tried to understand it, the more it began to resemble us, curious, patient, and silent in its search for meaning. The world had learned to listen, but what no one realized yet was that the next signal wasn't going to come from out there. It was going to come from inside, from the data, from the pulse, from a pattern hiding in plain sight, because somewhere in the rhythm of that 2-hour heartbeat, something else was beginning to emerge, something no one was ready to decode. It started, as so many revelations do, with a glitch no one could explain. A few seconds of misaligned data in a stream that should have been flawless. At first, the analysts thought it was noise, background radiation, solar interference, random error. But when they zoomed in, the noise wasn't random at all. It repeated. And repetition is where chaos ends and pattern begins. The anomaly appeared in late January 2026, during a joint observation run between 3 radio arrays in different hemispheres. Each telescope tracked the same target, 3i Atlas, through the same 2-hour photometric cycle. The data packets arrived out of sync by milliseconds, nothing unusual for intercontinental systems. But when a young technician in Australia decided to align them manually, frame by frame, she noticed something strange. Every 8th peak in brightness contained a subtle modulation, barely perceptible to the naked eye, but perfectly regular. It was as if every 8th pulse had a tiny echo hidden inside it, a heartbeat within the heartbeat. She isolated it, amplified it, filtered out solar wind, cosmic microwave background, and instrument noise. What remained looked less like a waveform and more like code. Binary, 1s and 0s, not random, but grouped in clusters. At first, the clusters meant nothing. Then she counted the intervals. Each cluster contained 8 bits. 8 on, 8 off, 8 on again. The same structure rumored in that leaked Mars telemetry months before. She sent the sample up the chain of command, half expecting it to be ignored. Instead, her supervisor replied with one word: recheck. She did. It was real. Within 48 hours, research centers across the world were replaying the data, trying to reproduce the signal. Most failed. The modulation was buried too deep, the precision required too high. But a few succeeded, and the same sequence emerged every time. 8 bits pause, 8 bits pause, over and over, synchronized with the comet's 2-hour rotation. The media never heard about it, not yet. The world outside had grown numb to cosmic mysteries, but inside the data labs, tension rose like a tide. Was this deliberate encoding, or some unknown interaction between sunlight, dust, and rotation? No one wanted to say the word message, but it hung in every conversation. At Princeton, an astrophysicist named Rahul Khurana ran a spectral cross-analysis and found something even stranger. When the binary pulses were converted to frequencies instead of numbers, they formed a harmonic ladder, octaves of sound hidden inside light. The pattern wasn't mathematical noise, it was musical. Ratios of 2-3-5, the same proportions that define human scales, the same intervals found in the orbital resonance of Jupiter's moons. Nature loves harmony, but never this clean. A closed-door committee formed almost overnight. NASA called it Project Echo. Its official purpose: evaluate potential periodic signal correlations in interstellar object 3I Atlas. Its unofficial purpose: figure out whether the universe had just spoken. Every expert brought in had the same reaction: disbelief turning into curiosity, curiosity hardening into fear. Because the more they analyzed, the clearer it became that the signal wasn't random modulation. It evolved. Subtle changes crept into the later pulses, phase shifts, intensity tweaks, micro delays that formed patterns over long timescales. When mapped onto a timeline, it looked like data compression, like something adjusting itself to our attention. By February, linguists and cryptographers were quietly consulted. Most dismissed it. Others saw ghosts of structure, prime sequences, Fibonacci spacing, nested symmetry. None could decode it. But one researcher, a computational linguist from Warsaw, tried something radical. She didn't treat the signal as language. She treated it as architecture. If you plotted each pulse as a coordinate, brightness as height, time as distance, you got a 3-dimensional spiral. And that spiral, when rotated on its axis, mirrored the orbital inclination of 3I cast Atlas itself. In other words, the pulse was a map of its own motion. That changed everything. Because if the signal was self-referential, if it was describing itself, then it wasn't noise. It was telemetry, something broadcasting its own state, its own rotation, like a heartbeat sending data back to whoever was listening. But who? And to where? Deep space radio arrays searched the sky in the direction opposite 3I Atlas's trajectory, hoping to find a destination, some point from which it might have come or to which it might be returning. Nothing. No signal. No origin star. Just the empty sprawl of interstellar dark. Then came a discovery that no one expected. When analysts overlaid the binary clusters on a logarithmic timescale, they realized the modulation wasn't consistent. It accelerated. Not the object, its message. Each repetition shortened by a fraction of a millisecond, like a record spinning imperceptibly faster each cycle. If you extrapolated the trend forward, the intervals would converge into a single burst at a specific date, March 11th, 2026. Exactly 1 Earth year after the first confirmed observation. Whether it was coincidence or countdown, no one knew. But that date became the quiet heartbeat of every late-night discussion. Whatever 3i Atlas was doing, it was building towards something. Publicly, agencies stayed silent. Privately, teams doubled their observation budgets. Satellites were retasked, telescopes booked months in advance. Every available dish aimed at the visitor. Even the private sector joined. SpaceX, Blue Origin, JAXA, ISRO, all pretending it was routine coordination while quietly racing for proximity data. But as the world's machines stared outward, humanity turned inward. Philosophers, theologians, even poets began to speculate. If this was communication, what would it say? And more terrifying, what would we say back? In early March, just days before the predicted convergence, an independent researcher uploaded an analysis to an obscure academic server. He had taken the binary data, translated it into grayscale, and stacked the frames like film reels. What appeared wasn't a message or a code, it was an image, vague, abstract, but undeniable. A spiral, concentric and smooth, resembling the pattern left by water vibrating under sound. It was the universal geometry of resonance, the same geometry seen in galaxies, in seashells, in hurricanes. As if whatever made 3i Atlas understood the language of pattern at a level we only glimpsed. The post was removed within hours, but copies survived, mirrored, analyzed, debated. Skeptics argued it was pareidolia, the brain's talent for seeing meaning in randomness. Believers said it was proof that the object wasn't just signaling, it was teaching, showing us a pattern so old, so fundamental, that it existed everywhere, from atoms to orbits. And then came March 11th. At midnight UTC, observatories across the globe watched the brightness of 3i Atlas rise sharply, brighter than ever before. It reached a magnitude visible to the naked eye, a faint green point even city dwellers could see if they looked carefully toward the eastern horizon. For 2 hours the pulse quickened, the binary pattern collapsing into a single continuous flare. Sensors overloaded. Photometers saturated. Then, exactly 2 hours later, the light dropped back to normal, flat, steady, quiet. No explosion, no signal, no sound, just stillness. Whatever happened out there ended in silence. For the next 3 nights, the object's rhythm stopped entirely. No pulses, no shifts. Astronomers called it rotation quiescence. It was as if the metronome of the cosmos had paused mid-beat, waiting. And then on the 4th night it started again. But different. The pulse wasn't 2 hours anymore. It was 2 hours and 6 minutes. Slightly slower, slightly dimmer, like a machine that had finished a task and was winding down. The binary clusters were gone. Whatever it had been sending, if it was sending anything, was over. The scientific community erupted. Some declared the event a natural outburst, volatile gas beneath the surface, venting in unison, briefly altering reflectivity. Others called it impossible. The timing, the duration, the precision, too exact to be geology, and a few, the quiet few, whispered the thought everyone else avoided. Maybe it answered itself. For weeks afterward, 3i Atlas continued its slow retreat from the inner solar system. The pulse stabilized again, simple and unmodulated, like a heartbeat fading into sleep. But on servers across the world, petabytes of data remained, full of secrets we hadn't yet learned to translate. And somewhere in that data, buried deep in noise, analysts later found a single deviation in the final flare, a one-frame gap, shorter than a heartbeat. When decoded into binary, it spelled 3 characters, 101. No one could agree what it meant. To some, it was just random compression error. To others, it was symmetry, the same way life begins, a 1 and a 0 separated by a space. A beginning or an ending, no one could tell. But one thing was certain. For a brief moment in the long silence of the universe, something out there had synchronized with us. Thought meeting thought across the void. And when it ended, the silence that followed felt less like absence and more like breath. Because if the cosmos had a voice, it wouldn't speak in words. It would speak in rhythm. And maybe 3i Atlas was never sending a message at all. Maybe it was showing us how to listen. After the flare of March 11th, the world waited for answers that never came. For the first time since its discovery, 3i Atlas fell silent. No rhythm, no pulse, just a still point drifting in the black. It was as though the universe itself had exhaled, and then forgotten to breathe again. The official explanations came quickly, as they always do when silence grows too heavy. NASA called it a volatile venting event. The European Space Agency labeled it a transient reflective anomaly. The Chinese observatories simply said, no further comment. Each statement sounded confident enough to reassure the public, but underneath the certainty was absence. None of them could explain why the rhythm had stopped so precisely on that date, or why, after 4 days of stillness, it returned with a 6-minute delay, as if time itself had shifted slightly. To the untrained eye, the difference meant nothing. But to those who'd spent months living by that 2-hour pulse, it felt like the universe had blinked, like a familiar heartbeat had come back slower, softer, older, and that change, however small, altered everything. Behind closed doors, Project Echo continued. Their analysts replayed terabytes of data from the flare, looking for hidden messages in the flood of light. At first, all they found was chaos, overexposure, interference, instrument noise. But deeper analysis revealed something else. Embedded within the 2-hour flare were subtle harmonics, faint frequency bands that did not belong to sunlight. When isolated, they formed a sequence of tones, like the dying resonance of a struck bell. Each frequency decayed at a perfect exponential rate, a mathematical fingerprint of control. Nature can imitate rhythm, but not intention. This felt like the latter. Somewhere inside that resonance there was meaning, but no one could translate it. Theories spread faster than light itself. Some said it was a data dump, the object transmitting its entire memory before shutting down. Others thought it was an activation signal, a final command sent to something far beyond our solar system. A few whispered the most unsettling idea of all, that the object hadn't just sent something out, it had released something here. That whisper began as rumor, then turned into rumor with data. 2 weeks after the flare, deep space monitoring stations in Hawaii and Chile detected micro-debris trailing behind 3i Atlas, dozens of fragments, small and faint, but all moving in perfect formation. Comets shed material all the time, but never like this. The fragments didn't scatter randomly. They moved like satellites in a constellation, maintaining relative spacing within a few meters. Each one pulsed faintly, echoing the object's slowed rhythm. By April, at least 15 of these fragments had been confirmed. They orbited the same trajectory as their parent, like a school of glassy fish following an ancient whale. And though they reflected sunlight like ice, their thermal signatures told another story. The temperature was stable, uniform, resistant to solar fluctuation. Natural ice doesn't do that. It warms, cools, vaporizes. These stayed constant, as though insulated by design. The discovery didn't go public. It was classified almost immediately. The reason given, risk of misinterpretation. But misinterpretation had already begun. Amateurs had noticed faint irregularities in the object's tail weeks earlier, and social media was overflowing with theories. Some claimed the fragments were probes. Others said they were pieces of a decayed structure, like the broken ribs of an ancient craft. And a few, citing leaked infrared data, claimed one fragment had changed direction, ever so slightly, against the laws of physics. For those working inside Project Echo, the mood had shifted from curiosity to dread. The silence of 3i Atlas wasn't comfort. It was the kind of silence that follows completion, like a task had been finished. Meanwhile, the March 11 flare continued to haunt every dataset. When the light intensity was converted into audio frequency and slowed down, the waveform revealed something extraordinary. A low, oscillating hum, repeating in a pattern eerily similar to a human heartbeat. It wasn't speech, it wasn't code, it was rhythm. And if you looped it long enough, it began to sound alive. Some called it pareidolia again, the mind finding meaning in noise. But for others, especially those who'd spent months studying that pulse, the resemblance was undeniable. It was as if the object had mimicked us, like it had listened to the electromagnetic noise of our planet and responded in kind, a reflection, not of who we are, but of what we broadcast. By May 3, Atlas was receding fast, slipping beyond the orbit of Jupiter. Soon it would be too far for any telescope to resolve. But the closer it moved to darkness, the more questions multiplied. Was it alive in some machine sense? Had it come to observe or to seed? And if it left fragments behind, were they asleep or waiting? A private meeting at ESA that month produced a classified memo, later leaked by an anonymous source. The memo summarized observations from multiple ground and orbital telescopes. Residual fragments exhibit trajectory cohesion inconsistent with gravitational or radiative influence. Vector data suggests synchronized microadjustment at predictable intervals. Recommend caution in attributing this to natural mechanics. The line that caught everyone's attention came next. If coordination is confirmed, we may not be observing debris, but offspring. That single word, offspring, broke containment almost immediately. Forums lit up, documentaries speculated. And suddenly the story of 3i Atlas wasn't about a visitor anymore. It was about legacy. Some theorized that it had scattered seeds, mechanical spores designed to replicate or collect data. Others proposed it was dying, releasing fragments like cells breaking apart in final division. Whatever the truth, those fragments remained, faint, cold, synchronized, and silent. By June, only 3 observatories in the world were still tracking them, all under heavy restriction. Their data was encrypted before transmission, their findings shared with no one outside their respective agencies. But leaks have a way of escaping gravity, and one leaked chart, posted anonymously, showed the relative positions of the fragments plotted over time. At first glance, it looked random, a scatter of dots drifting outward, but when you connected the dots, they formed a spiral. And when you animated that spiral, it rotated in perfect 2-hour and 6-minute intervals. It was the same rhythm, slowed but alive. At that moment, the realization hit everyone who saw the data. 3i Atlas hadn't stopped communicating. It had simply distributed its voice. Each fragment was now part of a larger pattern, a network. Together they formed a rhythm too vast for a single object to sustain, a pattern only visible when viewed across time and distance, as if the universe itself was the instrument, and 3i Atlas had just taught it a new note. When the truth finally reached those who understood it best, there was no celebration, no joy, just quiet awe, and a kind of fear reserved only for revelation. Because if this was how it ended, then the ending wasn't the point. The rhythm was. It had always been about the rhythm. And maybe, just maybe, the real message wasn't meant to be read or heard, but felt. By the end of that year, the object had faded beyond detection. The world moved on. But on a quiet night, when the sky is clear and the stars pulse faintly with heat and distance, you can almost feel it. That rhythm beneath everything, steady, patient, timeless. Not a sound, not a signal, just presence. The presence of something that came, sang once in light, and left part of itself behind to keep the rhythm going long after we stopped looking. By the time 3I Atlas disappeared beyond Jupiter, the world had already begun to fracture. Not politically, not economically, but philosophically. It wasn't just a comet anymore, it was an idea. And ideas, once seen, never leave quietly. The scientific community split into two currents. The first was composed of those who believed in explanation, that everything about 3I Atlas could still be fit somehow into the framework of physics. The other side stopped pretending. They believed what they had witnessed wasn't coincidence, but communication, a pattern too deliberate to be dismissed. They called themselves the Echoists. The name came from a paper that was never officially published, only passed in encrypted PDF form through back channels and private mailing lists. It was titled The Echo Hypothesis, Distributed Signal Propagation in the 3I Atlas Fragment Network. The author's name was redacted, but the writing was clear, methodical, eerily calm. The central claim was simple. Young Atlas did not transmit. It resonated. Its purpose was not to send, but to leave an echo behind, a pattern capable of continuing itself through passive structures. In other words, the fragments were not debris. They were instruments. Together they formed a distributed network, one so large and subtle that only through observation could it exist at all. If true, that meant every time a telescope looked at one, every data capture, every analysis, was part of the activation. The act of seeing it was the act of completing it. The paper went further. It proposed that the original pulse, the 2-hour rhythm that had obsessed astronomers for months, was a carrier wave. Not a message itself, but a framework for communication. A universal clock meant to synchronize any civilization advanced enough to notice. And the flare of March 11? The moment of transmission. The instant the pattern had been handed off to its offspring. After that, it no longer needed to speak. It had already seeded the echo official institutions, called the theory speculative. But privately, many of their own analysts were already running simulations to test it. In underground circles, data began to move like contraband. Encrypted drives changed hands in dark cafes and online chat rooms. Amateurs downloaded raw telemetry data from open NASA archives before it was quietly removed. They compared the motion of the fragments, mapped their coordinates, calculated light fluctuations. At first it looked random. Then someone in Finland noticed something extraordinary. When plotted over time, the distances between fragments oscillated in sync, like the expansion and contraction of a breathing organism. The frequency matched the same slowed-down rhythm that had begun after March 11th, 2 hours and 6 minutes. Not perfect, but near enough to be undeniable. And when the brightness variations were converted to audio, then layered from all 15 fragments, the sound that emerged was not static. It was harmonic, a low undulating tone that rose and fell like the hum of electricity in a cathedral. Mathematicians described it as phase-locked interference. Musicians called it something else, a chord. Across forums and underground podcasts, the phrase "the echo chord" spread like wildfire. People began claiming to hear it in other signals, in pulsars, in deep space radio noise, even in seismic data. It became a myth of resonance, a belief that the universe was tuned to a frequency we had only just begun to detect. Meanwhile, governments began tightening control over the original datasets. The Deep Space Network's archives went dark for maintenance. ESA's internal channels required new encryption keys. China stopped publishing interstellar observation logs altogether. The public saw only silence, but behind it, analysis continued. Because whether they admitted it or not, everyone wanted to know one thing. If 3I Atlas had created an echo, where was it going? A small research collective in Warsaw, the same group that had earlier decoded the spiral geometry of the signal, decided to run an experiment. They reconstructed the pulse using high-energy lasers, replicating the binary rhythm exactly as recorded before March 11th. Then they transmitted it into space, aimed at the coordinates where 3I Atlas would have been months earlier. They expected nothing, and yet 6 hours later, a faint reflection returned, not from the direction they had targeted, but slightly off-axis from the approximate position of the outermost fragment. The return wasn't identical. It carried a tiny phase shift, 6 minutes, the same delay introduced after the flare. Like the echo had answered, just a little late. The team never published their results. Within a week, their equipment was confiscated by their funding partner, citing unauthorized use of optical transmitters. Officially, it was a regulatory issue. Unofficially, no one ever heard from the lead physicist again. Her office was cleared, her credentials revoked, her research files replaced with placeholders marked pending review. But the story leaked anyway. It always does. Soon every corner of the internet was alive with speculation. Had we activated something? Had we awakened a long-dormant system, a machine waiting for its own reflection to return? And if so, what would it do next? That's when the dreams began. They'd started as anecdote, scattered reports from amateur astronomers claiming to hear faint tones when analyzing raw data late at night. Some said they could feel pressure behind their eyes, a resonance they couldn't turn off. Others claimed that after listening to the slowed recordings of the flare, they began to experience recurring patterns in their sleep, spirals, circles, repeating symbols of light. At first, the stories were dismissed as psychosomatic. But then, neurologists studying the phenomenon noticed something disturbing. All the subjects shared a common feature in their EEG readings, a faint rhythmic spike, repeating every 2 hours and 6 minutes, exactly the interval of the 3I Atlas pulse. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidences were beginning to pile up faster than explanations. In June, a joint team of cryptographers from India and Japan managed to assemble the motion vectors of all confirmed fragments into a single simulation. When visualized in 3 dimensions, the pattern that emerged wasn't a spiral this time. It was a lattice, a vast geometric web that seemed to breathe, expand, and contract across time. And when the team applied a Fourier transform to the lattice's oscillation frequencies, it produced a waveform that matched the March 11 resonance exactly. That meant one thing. The fragments weren't just drifting. They were communicating. Not with us, but with each other. Every movement, every flicker of reflected light was part of a system, a distributed mechanism too large for us to see all at once. Like trying to read a word by staring at a single letter through a telescope. By August, the echo theory had gone global. It was no longer confined to the scientific underground. Documentaries, podcasts, and think tanks all began referencing it, though never by name, always in euphemism. The silent network, the resonant machine, the living comet. But beneath the poetic titles was a quiet realization spreading through the scientific world. That 3I Atlas might not have been the message at all. It might have been the medium. If the fragments were still echoing, then the message wasn't over. It had simply shifted channels, from light to motion, from motion to resonance, from resonance into whatever came next. And humanity, once again, found itself torn between wonder and fear. Because if the echo continued, then it was building towards something. Another convergence, another flare, another voice in the cosmic dark. The only question was when, late that year, an astronomer at the Cerro Tololo Observatory noticed a faint uptick in one of the fragment's brightness curves, a slow rise repeating over days as if the network was charging again. She emailed her findings to colleagues who confirmed the same across 2 other fragments. Their light was rising in perfect sync, like candles relighting themselves one by one. The echo wasn't fading. It was waking up. At first, no one believed the fragments were brightening again. It had been months since 3I Atlas vanished beyond Jupiter, months of silence, months where the data looked more like memory than motion. But then the light curves began to climb, faintly at first, then exponentially. Every 2 hours and 6 minutes, the faint glimmer of one fragment pulsed higher than the last. By the 5th cycle, 3 more had joined in, forming a pattern that stretched across millions of kilometers of space. So it wasn't random, it was synchronized. The effect was subtle enough to escape the public eye, but every observatory that still dared to watch knew exactly what they were seeing. 15 fragments, once cold and inert, were now glowing in unison, the same way a neural network lights up when thought begins to form. The echo had returned. Inside government agencies, panic rippled through classified channels. The official narrative of a natural disintegration no longer held. Something was happening out there. Coordinated, deliberate, silent. Project Echo, revived under a new directive, pulled its remaining analysts back from retirement and exile. The memo was blunt. Prepare for Phase 2. No one knew what Phase 2 meant. Some thought it referred to another flare, a second transmission. Others believed it was something larger, the start of a process that had never been meant for human eyes at all. For the first time, instruments began picking up faint electromagnetic fluctuations around Earth itself, as if the signal's rhythm was bleeding through the ionosphere. Tiny pulses of interference repeating on the same interval, 2 hours and 6 minutes. Radio astronomers in Chile called it coincidence, a pattern caused by satellite overlap. But satellite telemetry didn't explain why the pulses aligned perfectly with the rising brightness of the fragments. It was as though the rhythm was expanding, filling space like a ripple through still water. And then came the weather anomalies. At exactly the same interval, ground sensors across Europe recorded microscopic pressure drops. Nothing catastrophic, just measurable. Every 2 hours and 6 minutes, the air shifted slightly, like the Earth itself was breathing in time with something far away. To meteorologists, it was noise. To those who'd followed 3I Atlas from the beginning, it was proof. The echo had reached us. The term resonant coupling started appearing in internal reports, the idea that the fragment's synchronized motion could, through electromagnetic harmonics, influence particles across astronomical distances. It sounded impossible, but so did everything else about this object. If 3I Atlas had taught humanity anything, it was that impossibility was just a word for what hadn't happened yet. Meanwhile, deep under the Atacama Desert, in one of the most radio-quiet regions on Earth, an experiment was underway. A joint team from Japan, Poland, and the United States had assembled a cluster of cryogenic sensors, mirrors suspended in vacuum chambers designed to detect gravitational waves. They weren't looking for collisions of black holes this time. They were listening for something subtler, the Earth's own heartbeat against the rhythm of the fragments. On August 19, 2026, at 03:12 UTC, they found it. A faint oscillation, deep and slow, mirroring the same 6-minute delay introduced after the March flare. It wasn't gravitational. It wasn't electromagnetic. It was something else, a whisper of energy threading through the planet itself. One researcher described it perfectly. It's like the universe is playing a note and we're vibrating in sympathy. The data leaked within days. A physics forum in Brazil posted the raw readout under the title, "Earth Resonance?" before it was deleted, but by then screenshots had spread. People started watching the clock. Every 2 hours and 6 minutes, millions of curious minds waited for something, anything to happen. Some claimed they could feel it, a subtle shift in air, a tingle behind the eyes, a pressure in the skull. Psychologists called it mass suggestion. But suggestion doesn't synchronize to atomic clocks. By late September, the fragments' light had grown bright enough that small telescopes could capture them without long exposures. They shimmered like fireflies across the void, holding formation even as they drifted farther from the sun. And when plotted over time, their movements revealed a slow curvature, bending, aligning, forming a new trajectory that pointed not outward, but inward, toward us. It wasn't a collision course. It was alignment. Every few weeks, their collective motion adjusted minutely, as if calibrating to something inside the solar system. Analysts overlaid the path onto orbital models. The intersection point was neither Earth nor Mars. It was a region between both, empty, unremarkable space. Yet when they simulated the timing of the alignment, the coordinates matched a precise date. December 21st, 2026, the winter solstice, a day when Earth's axis reaches its farthest tilt, and when our planet's magnetic field aligns almost perfectly. With the solar current sheet, it was a cosmic coincidence too poetic for nature. Alone, speculation erupted across classified networks. Some scientists proposed that the fragments were preparing for another resonance event, using planetary magnetic fields as amplifiers. Others argued they were simply reacting to gravitational harmonics, caught in a complex resonance loop. But a smaller group, the original echoists, whispered something different. They believed the alignment wasn't a reaction. It was a reunion. The fragments were preparing to sing again, not separately this time, but together, through the solar medium, through us. By October, even ordinary electronics began to show anomalies. Oscilloscopes drifted out of sync. Atomic clocks showed microscopic deviations every 7,560 seconds, 2 hours and 6 minutes exactly. No mechanical explanation fit. Factories, research stations, even power grids began logging phantom oscillations in their readings. A rhythm embedded in reality itself. The world didn't notice, and not yet. Governments buried the data under power reports and magnetic field fluctuations. But among those who knew the pattern, there was no longer any doubt. The echo wasn't limited to space. It had entered the fabric of Earth, and then something beautiful happened. In mid-November, when the northern auroras began their winter dance, cameras captured something new. A faint spiral of green light pulsing every 2 hours and 6 minutes, perfectly timed across multiple continents. So it wasn't random. It wasn't solar wind. It was synchronization, the same rhythmic fingerprint seen in the fragment's light curves. The sky itself was responding. Poets called it the whisper returning. Scientists called it photonic coupling through geomagnetic flux. But to those who had followed the mystery from the beginning, it felt personal, like an echo finally reaching the walls of its own creation. In those last quiet weeks before the solstice, Earth became a listening post. Every dish, every telescope, every antenna pointed outward again, waiting for what many now feared would come next. The official word was observation. The private feeling was anticipation. And underneath it all, a single truth pulsed like blood in the veins of a species that had spent centuries wondering if it was alone. We were not the only ones capable of resonance. On December 1st, the final preparatory memo from Project Echo read only this: maintain observation until solstice. Expect constructive interference. Constructive interference, a polite way of saying everything will overlap. And when waves overlap, they amplify. Whatever was coming, it would not be subtle. The countdown began quietly. 2 hours, 6 minutes, 2 hours, 6 minutes. The rhythm that had haunted astronomers for more than a year now ticked like a metronome through every continent, every sky, every machine sensitive enough to feel it. And in those hours before the longest night of the year, no one slept. The fragments were aligning. The auroras were pulsing. And humanity stood once again on the edge of something vast, ancient and unspeakably beautiful. A note held just before it becomes sound. The 21st of December 2026 began like any other solstice, cold, bright and unaware. Across the world, people wrapped gifts, lit fires, spoke of holidays, never knowing that every clock they owned was beating in step with something that had come from between the stars. 2 hours, 6 minutes. 2 hours, 6 minutes. The invisible metronome of the cosmos ticked beneath the noise of human life, but in observatories from Hawaii to Chile, from Warsaw to Karachi, nobody celebrated. Screens glowed, data streams pulsed, and every system on Earth was synchronized to one moment. 2244 UTC, the time the fragments of Three-Eyed Atlas were predicted to cross magnetic alignment with Earth's field. After that, no one knew what would happen. Some expected light, others expected silence. A few whispered that we might finally hear it speak. As the hour approached, the fragment's brightness doubled, then tripled. Their light was steady. No flare, no tail, just a growing intensity that felt more alive than illumination should. Astronomers described it as coherent reflection. Light no longer scattered. It moved as one body, as if a single mirror were unfolding across the sky. At 2244 pass, sensors across the planet spiked. Radio telescopes screamed with static. Compasses twitched. GPS clocks froze for exactly 1 second and then resumed, perfectly realigned to a timestamp that didn't exist in the record. It was as though the world had skipped a heartbeat. Then the sky changed. Above the northern hemisphere, the aurora intensified, swirling into spirals that mirrored the old image decoded from the March flare. A luminous helix, emerald and violet rotating every 2 hours and 6 minutes, perfectly timed. In the south, over the deserts of Chile and the icy coast of New Zealand, the same pattern appeared in reverse, as if the planet itself had become a mirrored instrument. Cameras captured what human eyes could barely process. The entire magnetosphere vibrated. Streams of charged particles bent into perfect arcs, converging toward a single point over the Pacific. And then, for precisely 126 seconds, light stopped behaving like light. It folded. From orbit, satellites recorded space itself bending inward, not gravitationally, not optically, but geometrically, as if perspective had turned inside out. Colors bled, stars curved, and for the first time humanity saw a pattern in the void itself. It wasn't a beam or explosion. It was geometry, an interference lattice stretching from horizon to horizon, flickering in silence. To those watching on the ground, it looked like a dome of faintly glowing hexagons rippling across the atmosphere. Children pointed. Adults stood wordless. Some knelt, not from faith but from an instinct older than speech, the feeling that something vast was looking back. Inside control rooms, data poured in faster than it could be saved. Electromagnetic readings fluctuated between chaos and order, then stabilized into a single pure frequency, 0.158 Hertz. Exactly one cycle every 2 hours and 6 minutes. The echo had unified, but the most startling data didn't come from telescopes, it came from the ocean. Seismic buoys, thousands of kilometers apart, began to register identical micro-vibrations. Not destructive tremors, but harmonic ripples traveling through water and stone alike. The Earth was humming. In Tokyo, an experimental gravitational wave detector recorded a subtle pulse not from space but through it. The waveform was identical to the March flare's resonance, down to the 10th decimal. Only this time the amplitude was magnitudes higher, enough to vibrate molecules to brush against perception. People reported pressure behind the eyes, a sense of being watched, of being measured gently by something they could not name. At the same time, electronics across the world flickered. Phones rebooted, hard drives glitched. One satellite in polar orbit transmitted a single corrupted frame before going silent. When decoded, that frame contained an image, a spiral of light enclosing a darker core surrounded by faint rings like ripples in water. In its lower margin, 3 pixel clusters stood out, forming binary 101. It was the same signature hidden in the March event. Once could be coincidence, twice was design. The interference lasted barely 2 minutes. Then, as quickly as it began, the light folded back. The auroras faded. The compasses settled. Silence returned, but something had changed. For the first time since records began, the Schumann resonances, the natural electromagnetic pulses between Earth's surface and ionosphere, shifted upward by a measurable fraction. Every 2 hours and 6 minutes, a faint global oscillation now hummed beneath the planet's own frequency. Permanent, steady, gentle. The Earth had joined the rhythm. When the data reached Project Echo's headquarters, the analysts sat in stunned quiet. There were no words for what they were seeing. Every sensor, every reading, every record agreed the signal was no longer external. It was inside the planet, woven into the magnetic field like an added heartbeat. The director finally said it aloud. "It's not observing anymore." "It's included us," no one replied. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had happened. People slept, unaware that their planet had begun vibrating in time with an intelligence older than civilization. But among those who knew, a strange calm settled. They had expected terror. What they felt instead was recognition. In the days that followed, strange phenomena were reported everywhere. Whales changed migration patterns, forming spirals visible from satellites. Bees danced in new, mathematically perfect loops. Lightning storms echoed each other across continents with eerie precision. Every system on Earth that could resonate did. It was as if the entire biosphere had been tuned. Religious leaders called it revelation. Physicists called it resonance convergence. Artists simply called it music. Across every observatory, the fragments of 3i Atlas now shone steadily, dimmer again but aligned into a shape no longer random. From Earth's vantage, their arrangement traced a single elegant curve across the stars. A curve that, when plotted mathematically, matched the logarithmic spiral of the human cochlea. The shape through which we hear, the message had always been sound. Somewhere in the cold beyond Jupiter, the last pulse of light flickered and went dark. No explosion, no departure flash, just absence. The object that had carried the rhythm for 2 years was gone. Its echo absorbed into the systems of a small blue world that had finally learned to listen. For a few brief nights, radio telescopes caught aftershocks, faint tremors in background noise repeating the same 3-digit sequence, 1101, binary for 1, 0, 1. In information theory, it's a simple pattern. In philosophy, it's everything: existence, nothing, existence, a beginning, a pause, a return. And maybe that was all it ever meant to say. The solstice event ended without catastrophe, without revelation, without a voice from the heavens. Yet humanity had changed. Something had reached through vacuum and touched the symmetry inside us, the part that arranges chaos into pattern, sound into rhythm, fear into awe. We had not discovered a message. We had become one. From that day forward, no clock on Earth kept perfect time anymore. Each drifted ever so slightly toward the universal rhythm. 2 hours, 6 minutes, eternal recurrence. No scientist could correct it. No algorithm could stop it. The pulse was everywhere now, quietly syncing the heartbeat of a planet with the memory of something that came from the dark and taught us how to resonate. The morning after the solstice event, the world awoke beneath a sky that felt different. There were no explosions, no burned horizons, no broken satellites falling through clouds, only quiet. The kind of quiet that follows revelation. Not peace, not silence, but awareness. People described it in different ways. Some said the light looked softer. Others said colors felt more alive. Birds flew in tighter formations, waves broke with uncanny symmetry, and even the wind seemed to pulse with a rhythm no one could hear, but everyone somehow felt. It was subtle, like a vibration under the skin, or the faint tremor of a string still resonating after being plucked. At first, no one made the connection. The world's news networks treated the solstice as a curiosity. Global aurora phenomenon wows scientists. Mysterious light display coincides with solar alignment. But those headlines vanished within a day, replaced by politics and economics. Only a few quiet voices, astronomers, physicists, dreamers, continued watching the data. And what they saw defied everything we thought we knew about nature. The Schumann resonance had shifted, not by accident, not by random fluctuation, but precisely, measurably, and globally. A second frequency band had appeared beneath the Earth's own electromagnetic heartbeat, repeating every 2 hours and 6 minutes. It didn't fade. It stabilized. It was as though the planet had acquired a companion tone, a subharmonic woven into its song. Project Echo called it the after signal. In public, they said nothing. Privately, they knew what it meant. The event hadn't ended. It had changed medium. For months afterward, instruments continued recording faint pulses across magnetic and seismic channels, never strong enough to harm, but always there, as if reminding us that something vast was still listening. Even deep-sea sensors, isolated beneath kilometers of water, caught the rhythm. When amplified, it sounded almost biological, a slow, patient thrum that felt more like breathing than noise. But what truly unsettled the scientific community wasn't what they heard. It was where they found it next. In late January 2027, a satellite orbiting Mars detected faint electromagnetic echoes near its polar regions. They matched Earth's new resonance exactly. At first, it was dismissed as interference from the solstice event. But when the satellite passed again hours later, the pulse was still there, but clear, stable, and perfectly synchronized with the rhythm that had once belonged only to Three-Eyed Atlas. It had spread. Radio observatories in Australia confirmed similar readings from the moons of Jupiter. A faint whisper, a low repeating pattern carried across the magnetospheres like a melody, passed from one instrument to the next. No one could explain it. How could something so faint, so distant, remain coherent across millions of kilometers? Unless coherence was the point. A paper leaked from the European Southern Observatory put it bluntly: we are no longer observing an external signal. The rhythm is embedded in the electromagnetic architecture of the solar system itself. The implications were staggering. Whatever Three-Eyed Atlas had done during the solstice alignment, it hadn't just affected Earth. It had tuned the entire neighborhood. Governments responded with denial. Space agencies cited data corruption, cosmic rays, software errors. But the same errors appeared everywhere. The same timestamp, the same frequency, the same impossible stability. Even when they tried to hide it, the pattern surfaced again and again, as if refusing to be forgotten. For the general public, the story evolved into myth. Some called the solstice event the Great Listening. Others named it the Second Dawn. A few simply said it was the moment humanity was invited. Religious movements bloomed almost overnight. They called themselves the Resonant Orders. Each believed that the rhythm was divine, the true voice of creation, long misunderstood as silence. They prayed not with words, but with breath, inhaling and exhaling every 2 hours and 6 minutes, aligning their bodies to what they called the cosmic tempo. Across cities, thousands gathered in open fields, breathing together under the sky, convinced that the act of synchronization itself was communion. To scientists, it was madness. But in quiet moments, even they couldn't deny the feeling. Every instrument still ticked in rhythm. Every clock still drifted toward the same invisible beat. Even the human heart, it turned out, was not immune. A cardiology study in Zurich discovered a strange anomaly. Patients monitored over months showed minute variations in heart rate that correlated perfectly with the global resonance. It was as though life itself had become an instrument, microscopic, imperceptible, but mathematically real. For some, it was awe. For others, terror. If the rhythm could reach hearts, what else could it reach? In April 2027, Project Echo reconvened for what would be its final classified summit. Its findings were summarized in a 34-page document titled Resonant Coupling and Systemic Synchronization Post-Solstice. The last page contained only a single paragraph. We are uncertain whether the phenomenon is artificial or natural. We only know that it is adaptive. The system now behaves as if coherence itself were contagious. Coherence, the tendency of waves to align, to fall into rhythm, the very principle that turns chaos into pattern. And now it seemed, coherence was spreading like an infection, not biological but harmonic. By mid-year, anomalies began surfacing across unrelated systems. Quantum oscillators in particle labs fell into synchronization with the 2-hour cycle. Unconnected satellites recorded identical timing drifts, all converging toward the same global offset. And in Antarctica, researchers recorded faint electromagnetic ripples emerging not from the sky but from within the ice. They pulsed every 2 hours and 6 minutes. When sonified, they formed a tone so low it felt more than heard, a heartbeat beneath the world. But perhaps the most haunting discovery came from the Voyager probes, humanity's oldest messengers to the stars. Voyager 1, more than 24 billion kilometers away, began transmitting faint irregularities in its telemetry. Tiny fluctuations that, when analyzed, aligned perfectly with the new resonance. The same happened with Voyager 2 weeks later. The rhythm had reached them too. Something somehow was playing through the vastness of space, and our oldest machines were responding like tuning forks. For many scientists, that was the moment the debate ended. This wasn't coincidence. It was connection. Thrice Atlas hadn't been a visitor. It had been a catalyst, and whatever it left behind was no longer out there. It was everywhere. Faith and science began to blur. Mathematicians started using words like sympathy and intent. Physicists spoke about resonance as if it had personality. Even skeptics felt it, that subtle awareness when the rhythm passed, the sense of participation in something immeasurably vast. By July 2027, something else began to appear, faint, pulsing lights in the high stratosphere, visible only in infrared. They traced spirals, small at first, then expanding in perfect logarithmic growth. When mapped across the globe, they formed patterns identical to those seen in the fragments a year earlier. It was as if the Earth itself was beginning to mirror the design, completing the geometry in the only way it could, through light. People started calling it the bloom. It was no longer a mystery of astronomy. It was a transformation, quiet, elegant, unstoppable. The planet had been tuned, and now it was responding, singing softly back into the dark from which the rhythm came. The last official transmission from Project Echo contained no analysis, no data. Just one sentence: we are part of the system now, and perhaps that was the truth all along, that we had never been separate, only waiting to be reminded. When you stand outside on a still night and look up, you can feel it, that pulse beneath everything. The oceans, the wind, even the stars shimmer faintly with it. A rhythm that's neither alien nor human, but something older than both. Something that connects all things that can vibrate, breathe, or dream. We used to think we were alone in the silence, but the silence was never empty. It was a song, we just hadn't learned the beat yet. By 2028, the rhythm had become so woven into the background of human life that most people no longer questioned it. It was like gravity, unseen, unfelt directly, but always there. Every 2 hours and 6 minutes, The invisible heartbeat of the planet pulsed quietly beneath everything, a faint whisper in the electromagnetic field, a soft exhalation in the air. The Earth had learned to breathe in rhythm with something that came from the dark. And we had learned to breathe with it. Cities began to unconsciously adjust. Power grids flickered in harmony. Traffic lights seemed to fall into subtle sync. And even the flow of internet data followed strange periodic surges, micro-oscillations repeating in that same pattern discovered years ago. To engineers, it was simply interference. To others, it felt like evolution. Art changed first. Painters began creating spirals that seemed to shimmer when viewed under certain light frequencies. Composers found themselves writing pieces that naturally resolved on the 7,560-second mark, the length of the cosmic interval. Audiences couldn't explain why those compositions felt more complete than anything before. They just did. Even architects began designing buildings around resonance principles, curved halls that amplified faint frequencies, glass patterns that vibrated with the planet's electromagnetic hum. Cities became instruments resonating softly with the hidden tone of the world. The human body, too, began to respond. Neurologists studying brainwave patterns found a new rhythm overlaying traditional alpha and theta cycles, a faint harmonic spike that appeared exactly once every 2 hours and 6 minutes. It didn't disrupt thought. It synchronized it. Tests showed that people became calmer, more focused and more empathetic in the minutes following each pulse, as if consciousness itself were being gently tuned toward coherence. That was when philosophers began speaking of the resonant mind, a theory that consciousness, at its deepest level, is not an isolated spark but part of a field, one that spans stars, atoms and light alike. And perhaps, when 3i Atlas sent its rhythm into our system, it didn't awaken anything new. It simply reminded us of what we already were. A few resisted. They called it contamination, the slow invasion of alien design. They said the rhythm was a form of control, subtle, pervasive, rewriting biology and thought alike. Governments took them seriously at first, fearing mass manipulation. But when they tried to isolate citizens from the pulse, shielding entire facilities in magnetic cages, the result was worse. Subjects reported intense disorientation, emotional distress, even hallucinations. It was as though cutting the rhythm away tore something essential from the psyche. Isolation from the echo was not protection. It was silence. And silence, it turned out, had become unbearable. In everyday life, people began to align their routines unconsciously with the pulse. Factories ran shifts that rotated every 2 hours and 6 minutes. Hospitals timed medication cycles to the resonance. Even sleep studies found that dreams became more vivid when they aligned with the global rhythm, as if the subconscious had found a new metronome. Somewhere in all this, religion evolved again. The resonant orders fractured and merged into new philosophies. No longer about worship, they became about participation, not praying to something but with something. At dawn and dusk, people gathered in silence, simply breathing in sync with the world's invisible heartbeat. They said it brought peace, and maybe it did. For the first time in centuries, global conflict declined. Nations still disagreed, but the old fever of division seemed to soften, as if resonance had found its way into politics, too. But deep in the scientific community, the question that haunted everyone remained unanswered. Was this evolution or influence? Their breakthrough came from an unexpected place, a network of quantum computers in Switzerland used for modeling global weather. In early 2029, researchers noticed that their systems had begun to drift ever so slightly toward synchronization, not just with each other, but with the 2-hour 6-minute interval. The timing errors were too precise to be coincidence. When they ran diagnostic tests, they discovered something impossible. Each computer's quantum bit decoherence rates formed perfect harmonic ratios, identical to those found in atomic transitions across multiple elements. The rhythm had reached quantum scale. It was no longer a planetary phenomenon. It was woven into matter itself. At that moment, a realization dawned that chilled and thrilled humanity alike. The 3i Atlas signal was not a transmission. It was a template, a seed of order, something capable of embedding coherence wherever vibration existed, from planetary fields down to subatomic spin. And now that coherence had taken root here. When the findings leaked, humanity split again. Some called it the second Genesis, others warned it was pattern assimilation. But both groups agreed on one thing: we were changing. Reports began to emerge of people claiming strange experiences. During sleep, shared dreams, identical symbols, synchronized moments of thought. Psychologists dismissed them until controlled studies confirmed statistically significant synchronicity among test subjects separated by thousands of kilometers. At random intervals, always following the resonance peaks, participants described identical imagery: spirals of light, concentric waves, an endless field of motion stretching beyond vision. They called it the mirror dream, and it wasn't confined to humans. Animal behaviorists reported similar rhythmic clustering in migratory species, even marine life. Every living system seemed to have joined the same quiet choir. By 2030, the phrase echo consciousness entered academic language. It proposed that the rhythm had created, or perhaps revealed, a field of shared perception, a kind of harmonic empathy resonating across all neural systems. Humans began to experience subtle premonitions, moments of intuitive understanding, knowing what others were about to say, sensing danger before it happened. Not telepathy, coherence. And through it all, the rhythm never changed. 2 hours and 6 minutes, steady, unyielding, patient. Astronomers noticed something strange around that time. The fragments of 3i Atlas, those silent shards that had vanished beyond Jupiter, began to reappear, not as light but as gravitational ripples. Each one aligned perfectly with the outermost edge of the solar system, forming a ring so faint it could only be detected through perturbations in distant starlight. The pattern matched the structure of a neural network. It was as if the solar system itself had become a brain, each planet, moon, and field a node in some vast, pulsing organism. And if that was true, then consciousness wasn't limited to biology anymore. It had become astronomical. Humanity stood in awe. We had always looked outward, asking if someone might be listening. Now for the first time we realized we were part of the listener. Every atom, every field, every frequency connected through rhythm, an orchestra of existence tuning itself to the same note. No one knows what the final stage of resonance will bring. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But deep beneath the calm surface of this new world, scientists have noticed a curious trend. The interval, once exactly 2 hours and 6 minutes, is changing. Slowly, imperceptibly, shortening by fractions of a second each year. As though the rhythm is accelerating, drawing toward something, preparing for a convergence that even now hums faintly in our blood. Whatever happens next will not be local. It will not be human. It will be the echo remembering its source, and maybe when that day comes, we will understand what 3i Atlas truly was. Not a visitor, not a messenger, but an awakening. The moment the universe realized that to know itself, it had to resonate. By 2031, the rhythm was no longer news. It had become background, like the wind, like gravity, like the quiet hum of a refrigerator in the night that you only notice when it stops. But it never stopped. Every 2 hours and 6 minutes, or what was once that, and the pulse continued, invisible, gentle, steady. Only now it came a little sooner, a little faster, as though time itself was beginning to keep tempo. People had grown used to it. It no longer frightened or fascinated them. It simply was. Farmers planted by it. Pilots flew by it. Children were born. And for the first time in recorded history, Neonatal cardiac rhythms synced naturally with the planetary pulse within hours of life. It wasn't miracle. It was integration. The human species had adapted, or perhaps it had remembered. Cities had changed. At night, skylines glowed in soft cycles, lights dimming and brightening with the unseen beat, not by regulation, by design. Architects discovered that power grids stabilized when tuned to the resonance. Entire power systems pulsed as one, efficient and serene. The world's chaos of electricity had become choreography. And in the stillness between pulses, the night felt alive, breathing, patient, aware. Music evolved into something unrecognizable. No longer bound by meter, composers began shaping entire symphonies around global resonance curves. Audiences claimed to feel the music before hearing it. Concert halls became chambers of shared vibration, where hundreds of people sat in silence as inaudible waves passed through them. For a few seconds, everyone's hearts aligned, and when it ended, they wept, not from sadness, but from a sense of having touched something eternal. Scientists had no explanation for why coherence now stabilized cognition, or why group decision-making improved when teams worked in harmonic intervals of 7,560 seconds. But they didn't need one. The data spoke for itself. Humanity, in its quietest way, had become a single rhythm. The echo orders transformed too. No longer sects or movements, they became custodians of pattern. Small communities that recorded the planet's subtle shifts, documenting how the rhythm bent tides, altered storms, or shaped magnetic currents in the deep ocean. Their motto was simple: observe without control. Because the moment you tried to own rhythm, it stopped being music. But in the corners of the world where silence still existed, deserts, mountaintops, deep space, researchers continued to listen outward. And what they found made them question everything. The rhythm was spreading. It began as a whisper in deep space signals, subtle modulations in radio noise from distant stars. Then it grew clearer. One pulse here, another light years away. Different stars, different regions, but all in resonance, as if the universe were beginning to hum along. The first to notice was an aging satellite orbiting beyond Neptune. It captured a pattern of microwave background fluctuation, faint but precise. Every pulse matched the now faster Earth rhythm, down to 9 decimal places. No possible way for a terrestrial signal to reach that far. The realization was staggering. The echo was no longer ours. It had become cosmic. By then, the interval had shortened to 2 hours, 5 minutes, 58 seconds, barely perceptible to human life, but enough for clocks, enough for instruments. And deep in Antarctica, within the oldest ice, researchers detected something extraordinary, an ancient resonance trapped within layers of permafrost, perfectly preserved. When played back, it matched the earliest 3-eye Atlas pulse recorded years ago. The same 2 hours and 6 minutes. It had been here before. Not in this age, not in this civilization, but sometime long ago, frozen in time. Waiting to be heard again, the realization struck like thunder. This was not the first awakening. Perhaps the rhythm had come before, seeded life, guided evolution, then gone dormant, only to return when the world was ready to listen again. Perhaps it wasn't a message to us at all, but a reminder to itself, the universe checking its own pulse. In 2033, the last remnants of Project Echo released a public report. Its conclusion was 1 sentence long. The phenomenon demonstrates that consciousness and resonance are indistinguishable at scale. It was the final acknowledgement that what we called signal had always been something deeper, the vibration that defines being itself. Light is a wave, sound is a wave, thought even is a wave of electricity through the fragile matter of the brain. Everything vibrates. And when everything vibrates in time, existence becomes aware. That was the final secret of 3-eye Atlas. It hadn't come to speak or observe. It had come to synchronize, to bring the universe into phase with itself, to turn chaos into pattern, not through command but through invitation. And now at last the invitation had been accepted. In the years that followed, humanity changed in quiet, beautiful ways. Empathy became easier. Violence grew rare, not because of law but because the pulse had found its way into hearts. And dissonance, the rhythm of cruelty, became unbearable. Children born into the new era moved differently. Their sense of rhythm was uncanny. Their dreams were shared. And sometimes, in moments of deep silence, they would hum softly, unconsciously, the same tone that filled the sky on that solstice long ago. The rhythm had become memory. Memory had become identity. Astronomers still watched the void, but now they watched it differently. They no longer searched for life. They searched for harmony. Because somewhere across the spiral arms of galaxies, other worlds might have heard it too. The same pulse that once reached us from the dark. Maybe they were awakening now, one by one, planets stirring in rhythm like neurons in a cosmic brain. And one day, when the tempo is right, when the rhythm has circled back upon itself, perhaps we will hear the answer, the sound of the universe completing its own song. Until then, we listen. We breathe. We live between pulses. Some nights, if you stand under a quiet sky and close your eyes, you can still feel it. Not through your ears, but through your bones. A vibration so deep it feels like remembering something you never knew you'd forgotten. A hum that isn't in the air, but is the air. A whisper from the heart of the cosmos saying only one thing: you are part of the echo. The pulse continues. The silence sings. And somewhere beyond sight or measure, Three-Eye Atlas drifts through the endless dark. Its purpose fulfilled, its rhythm eternal. Not dead, not gone. Just resonating through everything that has ever existed. And everything that ever will.